Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. It's the Ukraine War Update Extra video. Fourth time lucky, I've got it right this time. Giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Where should we go to first? Let's go to taking off in a jet. This is a Su-27 and a MiG-29 taking off from a highway somewhere in the territory of Ukraine in December 2023. This is incredibly significant for a number of reasons. I'll tell you in a second. Oh, I was hoping for the sound of jet engines, not the sound of ridiculous music over the top. Anyway, look, there's a jet taking off from a highway, and there's another jet taking off from a highway. The why that is significant because the Ukrainians need to conceal their jets around Ukraine because of the threat of Russian missile and Shahid attacks. If you can take off from a highway, then that gives you way more scope for concealing jets somewhere. Maybe it's some kind of forward operating area where you can organize to land on a highway and then store your plane somewhere safely nearby in a way that the Russians just simply wouldn't know you were there. They know where the Staro-Konstantinov air base is in Khmelnytsky, and they routinely hit it. When it comes to F-16s, I mean, one of the advantages of the Gripen over the F-16 is you can take off from highways, the short runways. You can have foreign objects. FOD on the debris, foreign object debris on the runway effectively, and it won't be too much of an issue with the Gripens because they don't suck it up in the way their air intake goes. With F-16 is a bit of a problem. Now, that's a challenge, but I don't know what the comparability is with these two, the Su-27 and MiG-29, with, say, the Gripen and with the F-16. If these are more similar in the way that their air intakes are configured with the F-16, and that's good news because you could conceivably put F-16 somewhere like this, or not put them there, but use areas like this to give you a greater scope for camouflaging where your airframes are, and also just in a way that you organize your operations and your sorties. It is going to be such a challenge with the F-16s because otherwise, there are only very few places the F-16s can be stored, can be, operating from. That this means that the Russians are going to have a greater chance of being able to destroy those F-16s. If they know they can only be stored in A, B, C, or D places, then they just need to hammer those places with cruise missiles, Kinzhals, ballistic missiles, Shahid drones, so on and so forth. They need as much elbow room as possible in terms of their use of airframes. It's really good news to see a Su-27 and MiG-29 taken off from a highway. Right, I'm going to pop into an editorial about the Balkans and about Serbia. Which is it's a short article. I'm actually going to read it to you. It's just worth listening to. I'm keeping Serbia in our kind of consciousnesses because it is so important. It's an area. The Balkans is an area of Europe where, although Serbia has not got accession to the EU yet, they are a kind of candidate state. They've been waiting for a long time. But they are also democratically backsliding and not looking like they're going to qualify anytime soon. But it's not the sort of place that you also want to just let go of. If you ignore Serbia and don't help it at all, then you are just allowing that nation to fall into the embrace of the Kremlin. So, according to Serbia's president, Alexander Vučić, the country's recent parliamentary elections were the cleanest and most honest in its history. They were also a triumph for his misnamed Serbian Progressive Party, SNS, which won in a landslide. But the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe had a different take. The 17th December poll said a statement by its international observer team took place in unjust conditions, marred by bias in the media, pressure on public sector employees, and misuse of public resources. Instances of intimidation and serious irregularities, including vote buying and ballot stuffing, were noted. Other allegations have been made that Bosnian Serbs would bust in en masse to fraudulently vote in Belgrade. Now, one of the stories we've heard, I've reported on, is that people on the sort of cancer list, they're waiting for a donation, some kind of organ donation, were bumped up the list if they were, in terms of priority, if they voted for the SNS. Flouting of democratic norms and the rule of law in Serbia has gradually accelerated since the SNS took power over a decade ago, a textbook process of state capture overseen by the president since 2017. An autocratic nationalist whose political instincts were forged in the Milosevic era, Mr. Vucic also uses his power and influence to foment discord in the Western Balkans, where secessionist ethnic Serb campaigns are supported by Belgrade. But the ambition to draw Serbia within the EU's orbit and away from Russian influence has muted Western criticism to a compromising degree, particularly since the invasion of Ukraine. This emollient approach may soon run out of road, says days of demonstrations have followed the disputed elections, building on a burgeoning anti-Vucic protest movement that began in the summer. Last weekend, tens of thousands gathered at Belgrade Square, who also used to oppose Slobodan Milosevic's rule and called for a largely silent Europe to back their cause. In a sign of where the government's instinctive sympathies lie, Mr. Vucic's Prime Minister, Ana Brnabic, thanked Russia for providing supposed evidence that the protests were orchestrated in the West. Intimations of renewed regional conflict promised to force a tougher line in Brussels and Washington. In November, Mr. Vucic ominously predicted that 2024 will bring, quote, much more conflict and unrest in both Kosovo and Republika Srpska, the ethnic Serb entity in Bosnia-Herzegovina. In the latter, the separatist Bosnian Serb leader Milorad Dodik has threatened to rip up the 1995 Dayton Peace Agreement in the name of Serb national unification. In Kosovo, whose independence Belgrade continues to refuse to recognise, serious outbreaks of conflict in the ethnically Serb north have raised fears of a future succession attempt. So there is all sorts of unrest going on. There's a rise in nationalistic fervour in Montenegro, which is a worry as well. Things are troubling, yet there are these shoots of democratic fervour that need to be nurtured, as we can see in these protests in Belgrade. And to ignore them, not to help them, is to imperil democracy, I think, in Eastern Europe. It's really important that those voices shouting in protest are supported. Anyway, back to the remainder of the article. Hopes that the prospect of EU membership would persuade Serbia's government to abide by democratic norms at home and refrain from undermining neighbouring states have proved unfounded, but the strategic goal of isolating Russia, also unfulfilled, means that the West continues to allow Mr. Vucic too much license to pursue his authoritarian ethno-nationalist agenda. As one of the chief investors in Serbia's growing economy, the EU is viewed favourably by much of the population and has economic and diplomatic leverage to deploy if it chooses. Up to now, it has opted not to do so, through an understandable fear shared by Joe Biden's administration of leaving the Balkans even more open to the influence of Moscow and Beijing. But as he entrenches himself still further in the EU's eastern backyard, treating Mr. Vucic as a kind of prodigal son who will eventually mend his ways is not working. And this is going to act as a segue onto our next, well, my next piece here. But I think this is a really difficult path to navigate for the EU, because if you give too much support to opposition, then that's too overt. Then in this case, the Serbian President Vucic and Russia can shout about how the EU is meddling. If you don't give support enough to those protest voices who are trying to change things for the better, democratically speaking, morally speaking, in that part of the world, then you're hanging these people out to dry. It's really difficult. Geopolitics is not easy, and that's why so much is done in the frame of plausible deniability, where you do things, there's lots of clandestine actions, but you can say, hey, we weren't involved, we weren't meddling at all. But this then harkens back to sort of Euromaidan and the protests there. How much, and this goes both ways. So it's very easy to just listen to what the Russian narrative espouses, to what Kremlin propagandists espouse, which is, oh, look at the involvement of the West. Look at Newland and McCain and people getting involved in the Euromaidan protests. But here is a place that's a really important part of the world where you've got people shouting out for their desire for democratic freedom, right? And to just leave them on their own in 2014, 2013 would have been disastrous. So they need that help. But of course, the more help, or the more kind of, if you go just to visit and say I'm a politician like McCain and say, look at this is so important, well done you guys, I'm going to give a speech to you, then of course Russia looks at that and says, look at McCain, look, the US are meddling in the political process in Ukraine. So it's really difficult, isn't it? And yeah, that's why what happens more often than not is things go on under the radar and it's all very clandestine and whatnot. But that part of the world is super important. So I'm going to segue onto Poland via this comment. And this comment sort of talks to the idea of changing people's minds, because then we're going to go on to talk about changing minds in a second. So this came to me via Matt on Twitter. He said, well, I got into my first online argument with someone saying that Putin is always right. How do you deal with this? I don't mean this argument specifically, as I noped out the conversations after he said that the West is prolonging the war and should stop giving aid. But how do you yourself feel after having conversations with people that have such a warped reality? I was perhaps too hyperbolic when I said that if Putin condemns it, it means you are doing the right thing. This guy is apparently a doctor of philosophy in Kenya. It blows my mind. I think my self-esteem is too low and I'm too thin-skinned to not let opposition get to me. I'm also desperately trying to finish my PhD, 2 months left in biochemistry, computational biochemistry, and don't have the time to argue on YouTube. You and me both, and yet that's where I end up arguing. Please feel no obligation to respond. I know how busy you are. Indeed, I am more busy than I've ever been in my entire life, but nonetheless, I will do you the service of responding. And thank you very much for this, Matt. So, it's such an important question. I've talked a lot about this before. I've talked a lot about the backfire effect. So if you are someone who has any particular belief and someone comes along with rational evidence that is opposing you fairly directly, then it is unlikely you're going to change their mind by direct confrontation. It can happen. Sometimes the weight of evidence is so much that you do kind of release your whole worldview and you do change your mind. It doesn't have to be a whole worldview. It can be just a particular belief, and if it's just a particular belief that doesn't have all that much of a central part in your worldview, then that's okay, and you're more likely to be able to change that view. I used to really like Apple phones, and now I like Android or whatever. You're like, okay, it's not changing my entire worldview. But if you're like, I believe the world is 6,000 years old, and that's entirely wrapped up with my theological understanding of reality and my belief in God. Now, therefore, if you disabuse me of this notion that the world is 6,000 years old, then my entire worldview falls apart. So I can't let go of that. And it's really important to understand this. And actually, that's a good example, because I've had these arguments in real life. And so there are certain things that are connected to certain parts of your fabric of reality, your belief about reality, that are so connected to other things that it means that it's very difficult to undo one thing without it affecting others. And so that kind of network keeps it stronger in your mind. So the example I just gave there was young earth creationism. So if you believe the world is 6,000 years, and I've literally had these arguments with people before and seen this happen, and challenge them on this. In fact, so we'll come to that in a second. So let's take a belief that the world is only 6,000 years old, right? So there's all sorts of evidence that that's not the case. Like I can disprove that. However, evidence. So the first thing to say is evidence doesn't often do the trick. Like, sadly enough, it'd be great if we could present evidence to people and that changes their mind. Like, here's the evidence, here's a rational evidence, there you go. You need to change your mind. Actually, because psychology is involved and because other things are involved, then that means that people don't change their mind on the basis of rational evidence, sadly. Sadly, for philosophy, it's kind of contingent upon psychology. And the 6,000-year-old thing is a really interesting idea because it's connected and to the idea of terror management theory. Terror management theory is this idea that we have something called mortality salience. Mortality salience is this understanding of our own mortality and how vulnerable we are and the fear of death, etc., etc. So what happens? Imagine you're a young Earth creationist and you believe the world is 6,000 years old. I come along and say, right, here's a whole suite of evidence to show you the world is not 6,000 years old, right? And you're presented with that evidence, and you think, right, okay, but if I no longer believe the world is 6,000 years old, and that is intrinsically linked to my belief in God and my idea of heaven and my idea of an everlasting life, then not believing the world is 6,000 years old, do you like it or not, rational thinkers, has an impact of whether I'm going to live forever or not. Literally, like, so if I stop believing the world is 6,000 years old, then my whole worldview just crumbles and I don't get to live in heaven for eternity. And so this is what goes on. People might not be cognizant of it, but this is actually what goes on. And so therefore, people will defend, even in light of huge amounts of, overwhelming amounts of rational evidence, people will maintain their belief in that the world is 6,000 years old and do all these contortions and they'll do mental gerrymandering so that they can maintain that belief because that belief underwrites their belief in an eternal life. And everyone wants to live forever in heaven, right? So it's like no one's going to challenge that because I can't handle not living forever. Or sunk cost fallacy. I put so much effort into my belief in this particular worldview that if it starts crumbling away, then all of that investment of time and effort into this belief over all my life is just a rotten investment, and I cannot have this sense that I have had rotten investment. So I'll chase good money with bad, or whatever that saying is. And so you end up just keeping on maintaining this worldview, even though there are serious cracks under it. And that one's a really interesting one because the power of desire to live in heaven for eternity for a lot of people. So what I ended up doing halfway through my philosophical arguing about everything with everyone to try and make sure people had the most accurate understanding of the world is I stopped arguing with creationists. So I used to spend an awful lot of time arguing all over the internet and in real life actually with people who believed the world was only 6,000 years old. And now I've gotten to this point where this is just pointless because they are using almost a different rational calculation to me that I just cannot convince them otherwise. And in fact, we can't have this rational argument about things outside of that area even because you are prepared to bastardize reality so much and to misinterpret things so badly and have this almost like a calculation machine, a function machine of rationality that is so distorted from mine that we just can't even discuss this stuff. We're talking different languages. To go back to what Matt says here, how do you convince people that are so entrenched in their position? The answer is it's really freaking hard. And if that core belief that they have, so say you're talking about Putin is wonderful and Russia is amazing. There are two things. One, if that's a troll, right, then there's no point because they're paid to do that. It doesn't matter what you say because actually nothing can convince them because they are literally paid to espouse things that they might not even believe that. They probably don't believe it, but it's their job. And so, yeah, there's no point arguing with trolls. It's annoying, and I do argue with trolls, but I know that there's no point arguing with trolls. Okay, the second type of person is that is their genuine worldview. So Russia is amazing, blah blah blah, and it's kind of linked to that whole heaven, 6,000-year-old Earth type thing. In that, if your entire identity is built on your Russianness, so if this is a Russian person, I know he's talking about a Kenyan person, blah blah blah. But there will be other sorts of connections that will be similar to this in terms of identity and other beliefs. But if your beliefs are interconnected and your idea of your own self is merged with your idea of your own country, which is merged with your idea of who Putin is. So Putin, Russia, me as Ivan, right? If my name's Ivan, my sense of Russianness, my sense of history, which is then coloured by state TV, and my sense of Putin, which is coloured by state TV, but merges with my sense of both history and culture and nationality and national identity, is then merged with my identity. If you then have someone coming along and trying to disabuse you of your idea of who Putin is, because it's so enmeshed with your sense of the sense of who you are and your own history and your culture, you can't just let that go and go, oh yeah, you're right, actually no, you are right, Putin is a bit of a dunce, he's a bit of a numbnut, and yeah, he is a bit morally bad. Because actually then that's like, well, my sense of Russia is then now completely distorted from what it was, and my sense of myself is now corrupted. And you have like an identity crisis, and everything you thought was right about the world is now questioned. And so it's like this keystone. You pull out the keystone, and the whole thing comes tumbling down to maybe this arched bridge or something like that. Then if Putin is the keystone to your arched bridge, you pull that out and it all comes tumbling down. So you have a choice. Either my whole worldview comes tumbling down and I have to start again, and that's sunk cost fallacy, and I've invested all this time and effort into building up this worldview. I either have to rebuild everything again and recognize that I was making terrible investments into my own worldview, or I can deny all the stuff you're saying by cognitive dissonance reduction. So, I've got information against my position. I need to keep so this is why we keep our whole core position. So I've talked about cognitive dissonance reduction heaps to you, and often say like we are far more likely to keep our original belief than change it in light of evidence. This is what I'm explaining to you now, is why we're far more likely to maintain our original belief. And then we go through cognitive dissonance reduction. So what this guy who Matt is talking to might be experiencing here is like, right, okay, you're challenging one part of my worldview, and even though he's a Kenyan PhD, whatever, I mean, assuming he's not a troll that's pretending to be that, assuming that is all correct, there will be no doubt a sense that this is all connected, because people build up worldviews that are kind of connected in lots of funky ways, and it might not be overtly apparent as you are arguing with them, but you start pulling at this and it pulls at everything else, right? So you start saying to this guy, this Kenyan PhD guy, oh, your information about Putin is wholly wrong, or oh my God, that makes you, Putin is morally egregious, which means that if you're defending him, you're morally egregious. Whoa, hang on, I can't be morally egregious, so therefore Putin can't be morally egregious, so therefore I'm going to disagree with you. And so you get to this point where Matt has come along with evidence against Kenyan PhD guy's worldview, and it might only be one aspect of that worldview, but it could pull apart as a whole worldview. So it's Putin, but it could be connected to a whole load of things. So either I start deconstructing my whole worldview, or Matt's wrong. How can Matt be wrong? And then it's all those cognitive dissonance reduction techniques. So either I bury my head in the sand and just don't think about it, blah, blah, la, 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 la. So that's one way of doing it. Or you shoot the messenger. I can tell you stories about anecdotes about this. I've written articles on this, but now's not the time. But you can shoot the messenger, which is, and I get that, some of you guys that disagree with the substance I say will attack me, because that's your way of I'm not saying that happens, but sometimes, particularly with kind of trolls, I will get the personal attack. Why do I get the personal attack? Because it's easier to attack me as a human being than rebut those substantive points that I've made. And so that makes you so Kenyan guy could attack Matt and say, shoot the messenger, and then that all disappears. Or you could take on board some of that, but adapt that data to fit your worldview. So there is a bit of compromise. Sometimes you can slightly change your worldview, and there's a bit of a meeting in the middle. But normally you're gonna find ways to get rid of this evidence that is contrary to your own worldview or your own core belief. And so your brain will just choose from one of a suite of heuristics or techniques to degrade the contrary evidence. You can poison a well is one way of either attacking the person or attacking, you got that information from Foreign Policy magazine. Well, Foreign Policy magazine does XYZ, blah blah blah. And interesting, so this is a point I'm going to concede in a second when we talk about Poland, but that's what will happen. So this then goes. So situation is, it's very difficult to change someone's mind like that. Sometimes it does happen. So I am an atheist philosopher of religion. That's what I mainly have traditionally done, argued about whether God exists and argue about religion. And sometimes you come across people that you argue with like this, and then there's a tipping point where there's enough evidence or there's some kind of trigger that means that they do a 180 switch and just throw off their entire worldview. But usually what happens then is they become quite enraged with having sunk those costs into something that they now feel is wrong, and they get angry. The people that do that end up, at least at the beginning, being very angry new believers in whatever, or lack of believers, or new worldview. Will entail being quite angry, and then also, if they are really strong in their original belief, if they do a 180 switch, they will become equally evangelical going the other way. So you get people who end up being, so say in atheism, theism, so you might get an evangelical Christian and then arguing with them as an atheist philosopher, and then sometimes, very rarely, they go, oh, you're right, and actually it goes like that, and then they become a militant atheist who is really angry about religious believers, and then spend the next 10 years of their life arguing with religious believers because they're so angry that they've invested all that time and effort into something that they now think is wrong. That can go both ways. I'm not trying to advocate any particular worldview. I'm just trying to exemplify the psychology that's going on here, right? I mean, I edited a book some years ago called Beyond an Absence of Faith, stories about loss of faith and the discovery of self. And actually, there were some interesting psychological journeys that people went through that you can pick out from some of those accounts of doing that. But as I talked about the other day, the other way of the kind of the healthier way of changing people's minds is to just nudge them from being within their in-group. So rather than being like that, so Matt's never going to convince this Kenyan PhD guy. But if you were, say, a Kenyan person, just a Kenyan person who had a slightly different view from that guy, then he's like, oh, you're Kenyan, it's not this. It's like, oh, you're part of my group. All right. Oh, you got that slightly. Oh, that's nuance. Oh, okay. And you kind of nudge them, and they're like, okay, right. And then they're in this new position, and then someone else can then be quite similar to that with a slightly different view and just nudge them further. And then you can have this general shifting over time that ends up with you being in that opposite worldview place. Like, okay, I no longer believe Putin and the central planning in economics is actually not so cool, and that you've been disabused of a load of things, but it's happened slowly over time. And when you finally got there, you're not angry. You haven't done this big switch. You don't feel that you've sunk all these costs and yada yada yada. And you're just, okay, I've completely changed my opinion, but I'm in a healthy position in believing what I now believe. And so, unfortunately, that is going to happen more often than this, right? And so, what can Matt do? Sadly, I don't know if this is just too depressing, but sadly, probably not a lot. Just hold your ground, present rational evidence, or pick some things that you can get them to change their mind slightly on and sow seeds. So there have been people on this thread here. So quite often it's about not what you say, but how you say it. It's about who you are as well. I've talked about who you are being really important, and if you're too much like that. So sometimes when I'm really like that on these videos, and I get all ranty and righteous, right, about my own beliefs, that triggers some of you to go back at me. So say I give some of my liberal lefty views to you and I give them in a really forthright fashion. You'll notice that on the threads below, a bunch of you will be like, oh God, you bloody blah, and having a right go back at me because of this backfire effect where you entrench in your original position even more so. And it gets like this. Whereas if I was a lot more softer and was, being all matey with you and just picked one little bit, but just instead of moving it like 180, just said, oh, how about over here? Then some of you might go, oh, okay, yeah. Oh, right, so there's only a little change there. I can see the benefit of that. And the way you said that, was quite funny, or there's this or that. And that may develop, that seed might fall on more fertile ground, to use ironically a biblical analogy there. So it's more likely a seed will fall on fertile ground if you are delivering it in a way that's appropriate to the audience that you have, and maybe you're likable, that you don't go in all guns blazing, and so on and so forth, and that you're more like them, etc., etc. And you can't always achieve all of those things. If you're not in their in-group, then you can't like generate yourself to be in their in-group, so on and so forth. So it's really difficult, but sometimes you're sowing those seeds. So I was just going to say that there are people now on my threads who have said, do you know what? I really used to like Musk, but actually over the time of what you've said, because you're dropping it in, and I'm with you on all these other things, and actually I was really against that when you first mentioned Musk, but then by the 15th time, and the same kind of information, the same kind of data that's coming out, I understand, I can see the pattern, and some people are open-minded enough to go, yeah, okay, he was great with this area of his life and this area of life, but actually on Ukraine he sucks bad, right? Now, some people are willing to do that. Some people will still attack me to the top, because they will never be disabused from the fact that Musk is a god, right? So for some people, that again, it's that identity, that whole identity, Putin, Russianness, culture, history, language, everything's all melded together. So I can't lose the Putin is a god figure. If I'm disabused of that, then I lose everything. So it's the same with Musk. It's for some people, they are such big fans of Musk, and it's built into the fabric of their political landscape so much that if they were to lose Musk out of that, then there's a big hole, and it pulls other things, and everything starts. No, so they can't do that. So Musk has to stay. So rather than me take on board the criticism of Musk, I'm going to attack JP for saying all this stuff. Why do you keep going on about Musk? And have a go back at me. And it's like, dude, I'm just telling you how I see it about Musk. But that kind of defensiveness, I think, speaks more about the weakness of their position than the weakness of my position. So if people get really enraged when I say things, that enraged feeling, I think, belies a kind of possibly a crumbly framework to their own worldview. That's just a bit of speculation for me. Anyway, that's my tuppence on that subject. Goodness me, wasn't that a lot of speaking? Have I got time to even go on to my main topic of conversation? Not really. Shall I just leave it there? Well, I'll just mention very quickly. Okay, I'll try and be really quick. So what's been going on is I've been. I really do want to talk about this at depth, though. I've been having this conversation, but I haven't fulfilled their desires. A conversation with someone called W. Bin, who is, I think, a Kiwi, who is asking me to watch a long documentary series on TVP about Donald Tusk. Now, they have taken on board this TVP documentary series, and they seem to hate Donald Tusk and seem to love TVP. and want me to watch all that documentary and change my view on Donald Tusk. And you could see me as being entrenched in my position. No, I'm not going to do it. But the issue I have is that TVP is a really problematic broadcast, and it has been since 2015. And all the analysis show that, and I've talked to you about that before. And I know they said good things on Ukraine, and TVP World was really good, and yeah. But it doesn't mean that all their other stuff is good, because actually that's part of their agenda. They were very much a conservative network. Well, they're a public broadcaster under the auspices of the Polish PIS party, the Justice and Law Party, who were becoming more and more authoritarian, and they had a very much an iron grip over TVP since 2015, and they're also, the PIS were having a go at the judiciary in Poland, and they were democratically backsliding. This was worrying the EU, and it's worrying people like Reporters Without Borders, who had said there's democratic backsliding, who was saying this is not cool with the judiciary, it is no longer independent. And you had Freedom House as actually I think US-based human rights freedom charity, who was saying, although Poland as a whole gets a good score for freedom in their elections and stuff, they do run free and fair elections in their mechanisms of the elections. But when you start looking at the messaging and the involvement in state broadcasting and media, Poland are much further down the list. And when you look at the judiciary, they get the lowest score from Freedom House in their whole freedom index. So there are elements of Poland that have been really worrying, and that's what's been worrying the EU. And they're saying, right, you're in the EU, but now you're democratically backsliding because the judiciary is no longer independent. They're in the pocket of the PIS. The media is in the pocket of the PIS, and the media are spreading stuff about other people. One of them is Donald Tusk, and they brought in the Lex Tusk, basically the Tusk law, to try and invalidate him from running as opposition leader, so that that they could stay in power effectively. Right. So what W. Ben's trying to say to me is, no, but Donald Tusk is a terrible person because he was really pro-Russia way back when, etc., etc., etc. And this is a really big topic. I mean, the first, because I'm sad, I literally read Polish comments to documentaries on YouTube that people want me to watch. Anyway, it says, as for the film, it's clearly visible to the naked eye, a collection of situations from different periods, directed clumsily and tendentiously, which is confirmed by repeated images, statements. Wise people remember the time. This is the important part. Wise people remember the times when almost the entire world had good relations with Russia. Do you remember, man, when your President Kaczynski, probably in 2008, made an appeal to TV to the Russian brothers, encouraging them to cooperate as Slavs? Tusk was no exception, because most countries wanted to cooperate with Russia, which was already initiated by Gorbachev. Those were different times, and bringing up these situations now is simply illogical. In other words, Donald Tusk was pro-Russian a long time ago. And that's because everyone in Europe was. So when you start looking around at what Merkel was doing in Europe, her legacy is now being tainted by questions over Germany's Russia policy. So for some, the original sin dates back to NATO summit in Bucharest in April 2008. According to some people, when she declared herself against Ukraine and Georgia's accession to the North Atlantic Alliance, a position also shared by the French president at the time, Nicolas Sarkozy, Angela Merkel whetted Vladimir Putin's expansionist appetites. 4 months later, Russia attacked Georgia. The postponement of Georgia's accession date strengthened Russia's determination to take action, condemned at the time the Czech Foreign Minister Karel Schwarzenberg in Der Spiegel. Appeasement is not an alternative, he added, without considering that this same approach would be made without Angela Merkel's policy toward Moscow. In other words, the EU's general policy via Angela Merkel towards Russia at the time, and for a long time, was, we want Russia and Putin to change their ways by being enveloped into trade into the EU, but not into the EU, but in interacting with the EU. We're going to do trade deals with you. We are going to economically interact with you. We're going to buy all sorts of cheap hydrocarbons off you, which is good for us and hopefully good for you, in that, globalization will change you, it will redeem you, it will transform you. And I said a year and a half ago, I did a bunch of videos where I talked about this, saying, I don't blame Merkel for that. It was wrong in hindsight, but hindsight's always 2020. But at the time, you can understand why people would have gone, right, it's beneficial for us economically with our hydrocarbons, but also, like, globalization does change people. And actually, this is a really good opportunity to get democracy, to get a foothold back in Russia through kind of capitalism and globalism. Okay, it's just, it failed in the 90s, Russia, in its dabbling with democracy. Let's try, and capitalism. Let's try again. Let's do that by inviting this person into our fold and getting them to change. It's a bit like, this could be a totally strangled analogy. It's a bit like Footloose in reverse. So if you know the film Footloose, right? Kevin Bacon from the city comes into this religiously conservative, structured small town society, and he actually changes all of them. But imagine it in reverse, where you've got that person from the structured kind of strategic planning, ideologically traditional, Russian scenarios. So maybe the pastor's daughter from Footloose going to the city to live near Kevin Bacon, and Kevin Bacon and his friends change her to become more liberal and more, urbanized and more, etc., etc. That's what Merkel and Europe were wanting to do with Russia. Come to the city, come and see what it's like here. Hey, if you wanna, do deals with us and trade with us and be our mates, you'll need to change. Okay, you're going to change. But what happened is that failed because actually Putin was just, well, basically his grasp on Russia was so iron-like in terms of it being an oligopoly. So you've got this, it's not the strategic communist economy it was, and it's not capitalism, but it's kind of the worst of both worlds, in which you are concentrating all of that money on the very few at the top, and people taking over the national industries, very few people taking over it, and Putin taking 50% of everything. If you listen to the work of Bill Bauder, Putin is the richest man in the world by a long shot, and he is 50% of what is being made from all of these. So he's stupendously rich. Now, try and get him in and change him. Actually, there wasn't enough attractiveness of the European worldview to get Putin to change, and it failed. But I understand the rationale in trying, and I don't blame Merkel. Like I can understand explanatorily why Russia's got to where it's got, and why Ukraine's got to where it was, and Europe's got to get it where it was. But I don't fault Europe for trying that mode. It failed, and in hindsight, we can say it's a wrong thing to have done. But at the time, I think I would have advocated something like that. Okay. So then now people are like sort of blaming Merkel. So Merkel's Russia policy was pure appeasement. And it was, but again, you can understand why it was, they tried it. The Merkel government's softness on Russia can be traced to a strain of romanticism regarding Russia in the party, Kiesewetter said. So he's in the CDU with Merkel, but he's opposed to her appeasement position. There was also a lot of romanticism regarding an appease Russia or regarding negotiations, change by trade. That's what I'm talking about, change by trade. Trying to come to grips with Russia, and this was wrong. Yeah, it's wrong now because it didn't work. But had it worked, everyone would be going, that was great what Merkel did. See how much we changed Putin. See how democratic Russia is. Had that worked, it'd be the greatest thing ever. But it didn't work because there was just some miscalculations, or Putin was just too far gone. The pro-Russia wing of the party was blinded by economics. And I think this is the case. It believed that with cheap energy from Russia, cheap supply chains from China, and cheap security from the US, Germany would be prosperous and secure forever. This attitude was wrong, and it advised it was cheaper, but it was not worth the price. Scholz's SPD, so that's now the opposition party to CDU, has also found it difficult to shake off its own strain of romanticism towards Moscow, Kiesewetter said. Within weeks of the Zeitenwende speech last year, when it became apparent that Ukraine would not fall within days, Germany's neighbours, such as Poland and the Baltic states, saw Germany come back to its old behaviour, being reluctant to invest too much, and so on. Now, then when you come to look at Tusk was like that with Merkel. And what TVP, as its documentary series, I think is trying to do, is paint Tusk as this pro-Putin Russian puppet. But that is absolutely not where he is now. So what happened in, say, 2014, this is a 2014 EU Observer article, but unlike Merkel, he has given up on Moscow, with Russia relations set to make or break his EU tenure. So when he went then into the EU as a parliamentarian in the EU, he was very much anti-Russia. So Brussels, this is 2015, so this is 9 years ago. Senior figures in the European Union brandish a threat of new sanctions against Russia over the weekend violence in eastern Ukraine, with one blasting that what he called appeasement of Moscow, and that's Donald Tusk. So that remark on Twitter by Donald Tusk, the former Polish Prime Minister, who now chairs summits of EU leaders, used language recalling the eve of World War II that conveyed both fierce condemnation of Russian President Putin and criticism of recent EU talk of easing sanctions against Moscow. So in 2015 onwards, which is a time when TVP was infiltrated, was starting to be controlled by the Polish PIS government, and you had a really strong conservative far right government get into Poland. Donald Tusk was going on the anti-Russia journey that took him away from his previous Merkel appeasement positioning. And so what you then have is a different Donald Tusk that is being portrayed by W. Bin, who's arguing so vociferously against me. Just people do change, and I think Donald Tusk has changed, and he is now the hope for Poland in being both pro-democracy in a way that PIS weren't, being pro-EU in a way that PIS weren't, being pro-liberties in a way that PIS weren't. Think about individual reproductive rights and all these sort of things that PIS have been squeezing, and also anti-Russia. So for me, politically, he ticks all my boxes. Right? Whereas PIS previously ticked one box for me, and that one box was anti-Russia. Everything else about PIS sucked big time. I used to write stuff on PIS way before this war started. I was going to write a massive feature article about Poland and getting into bed with conservative religiosity through one of their universities and trying to make religious leaders of the future, as in religious political leaders, much like we have seen them do in the US. You look at Speaker Mike Johnson. Anyway, there's a real parallel that they're trying to do that, and indeed there's conservative funding coming in from the US into Poland to try and get them to do that. So there's plenty I can talk about Poland, but and none of it's good politically speaking for the last 8-9 years, right? It is good that PIS are not in charge anymore of Poland, and if you want to demonize Tusk, go for it. Good luck. I want to look at where he's at now and where he's going to take Poland now, and I think that's in a much better direction. It was in a good direction in terms of Ukraine previously, but everything else bad. Now, I don't think we're going to get continued democratic backsliding. I think we'll get an independent judiciary, and I think TVP will be more objectively neutral, certainly than it was. It would be too risky for Tusk to then turn that into his own mouthpiece, because he's just spent years venting against that. So yeah, that's my more than tuppence on this return to the Tusk discussion. But again, it goes back to changing minds and there's all the stuff that I've talked about, all that psychological stuff is going to be relevant in this argument in both my positioning and W. Bin's in terms of our intransigence in changing our minds. But I am led by my sense of political morality when it comes to going forward. That was then. This is now. Tusk has changed course, and he changed course a long time ago. But TVP would have you believe that he's in a pocket of the Russians, when actually, when you look at his actions over the last 9 years, that has not been the case, in my opinion. Anyway, let me know what you guys think. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate all of your support. This has been a long one. Toodle pips.